Um, well, good morning, almost afternoon, I guess, everybody. Thanks for sticking around for this portion of the presentation today. Corey Jensen, our National Register Coordinator, and I will be doing an overview of historic buildings and architecture. Corey will be taking the bulk of the time talking about the history of architecture in Utah and the different types and styles that are encountered throughout the state. We'll also discuss some potential integrity issues and aspects of these different architectural resources. I'll briefly discuss what architectural resources are, versus archaeological resources per se. And I'll also talk about our historic site forms, both our intensive level survey site forms for individual properties and our reconnaissance level survey forms for multiple properties. We also have some time at the end for questions, but please feel free to ask questions during our presentation too. We'd like this to be a little bit interactive if possible. So, and there's a lot we could talk about when it comes to historic architecture, especially relating to Section 106 or 404 preservation compliance work. We're really only scratching the surface here. So during our presentation, please think about other specific topics you'd like for us to present and address in future meetings, as Merritt mentioned earlier too. We'd like to do more of these trainings and gear them to what's most useful to you. So next, Sam. So one of the questions that I get on occasion and wanted to address here is when to record something on a historic site form versus just an archaeological site form, since I know a lot of you are archaeologists or work in CRM. And I'm taking a lot of this information directly from our archaeological guidance for compliance that you can find on our Section 106 webpage, or E106 portal. This topic's a big gray zone for many in terms of documentation, and it can be a little bit challenging for our SHPO reviews as well. This is most useful for archaeologists who also do some architectural documentation as part of their work recording archaeological sites. But the question is, how do you document historic period architectural structures or elements, and when do you put them on an architectural historic site form? And I'll mention our different types of historic site forms here in a minute. A general rule of thumb within the Utah SHPO of when to use the historic site form for buildings is the presence of a street address. If a building or structure has an official address, then it should be recorded on a historic site form, in addition to the archaeological site form you're creating, if you're surveying a larger archaeological site. Buildings with addresses are easy to recognize in urban areas or developed rural communities too. But what about abandoned homesteads or other buildings and structures that are in places that don't have formal addresses? If you don't have an exact address, that's okay. Our site forms do have a place to put coordinates as well. So our office also encourages the use of historic site form for archaeological sites with standing architecture, as defined by the presence of recognizable wall elements above 4 feet tall or taller. So if you're documenting an archaeological site with such a building or structure within your survey or project area, we'd ask you to complete the historic site form in addition to the archaeology site form that would document the remainder of the property, and add it as an appendix at the end. You can use our standard historic site form or the abbreviated site form version that I've created for 106 use specifically. And I'll mention those more in a minute, like I said. We like the use of a historic site form for architecture and encourage it, as it's structured to guide the person doing the survey to answer specific questions regarding architecture in a manner and format, that's not generally found in archaeological site forms. So once again, if you're doing an archaeological survey, if you ever have questions about the building, please don't hesitate to contact me or Corey or Savannah, somebody in our office, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that building and how to record it. So, with the photos you see on this slide, the building on the left should be recorded on a historic site form, while the remains of the building on the right would not be. So next slide, Savannah. Another question that I often get is what site form should I fill out for my historic building that I'm documenting? So I wanted to touch upon that a little bit. There are essentially two types of surveys that are done on the historic building side of the office. Intensive level surveys, which are surveys that are completed for individual buildings using our historic site forms. And there are reconnaissance level surveys, which are surveys involving a larger geographic area that includes many buildings. By many, I mean if you have about 10 or more buildings that you need to document, depending on the project, you'll likely want to complete an RLS for that. So a little bit more about each of those survey forms. Next.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Real quick, I don't like to interrupt you, but Megan Daniels asked, can we talk about dams and where they fit into this scheme, or do you want to circle back on that?
No, we can talk about dams now. Dams are, that's a specific resource, right? We could talk about a lot of different specific resources. Maybe that's another training too, is to talk about the different resources, we record an archaeological site form or an architecture site form in general. But when we talk about dams, we've seen it both ways in our office, honestly. We've seen them recorded on archaeological site forms, particularly if the dams are no longer used and they might be ruins. And we've seen them on historic site forms where they are, clearly a visual, architectural element. We've seen people add them on historic site forms and they're in the architecture side of the office. So I mean, I hate to be kind of wishy-washy here. But I think it depends on the dam. And, if you're recording a larger archaeological site, with the dam, in conjunction with the dam, I'd say do an archaeological site form, then add the dam information on a historic site form as well as an appendix to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to railroad you. That's definitely
No, you're fine.
I think perplexing type of resource where we never know if we're going out to record it. Like, do we send archaeologists or are we sending architectural historians? Are we doing both? But I guess it's good to know.
Yeah,
we're all kind of in a gray area together.
Yeah, and we're starting to see more and more dams being worked on right now, of course, because of the, I guess, drought situation, other things that are happening here. People are wanting to really, fix up dams, and we're starting to see all the dam projects. And so it is something we are addressing, internally as well. Zach just said the Bureau of Rec prefers archaeological site forms at a minimum.
Yeah, and maybe Hanson, for me to jump in real quick and belabor this dam conversation. But these types of resources, do have some complications. As Hanson mentioned, like having a more modern dam that has a lot of support facilities and roads and ancillary side facilities, like that lends itself better to how an archaeological site form is structured, where it's more of a site-based perspective versus a building that usually it's more of a building or a structure focus, like an individual entity. And so that's why we always try to use the best tool. That if it's a standalone dam, maybe a building structure is fine. But for most of our consultation, probably all dams will have an archaeological site form. Some dams will have the building form attached to that, if maybe that's more to the point.
That's
Yeah.
great.
And, Savannah and I were talking about a dam, just recently too, that was recorded as a non-architectural feature. And it was clearly in, an architectural historian's opinion, an architectural feature, but that's how the archaeological site forms have it listed, categorized as, a non-architectural feature. So, I guess we're still grappling with it too, in some ways, but I guess archaeology first, and maybe in addition, architectural site form too.
Yeah, because an earthen check dam probably don't need a building form for it, but Schofield Dam, probably should have an architectural form for it. Now, how that translates to the company, like, are you setting out an architectural historian and an archaeologist? I think that's even more gray zone, because if it's purely documentation in the field, that's one thing. If it's assessment under criteria A, B, or C, then obviously you might need a different skill set for the architectural assessment of a dam. So that might be where it's even a little bit muddier, that a general field technician in archaeology has never once seen a dam or seen an assessment of a dam. They don't know how to describe it or assess it appropriately for eligibility. So that's where Secretary of Interior standards for archaeology and architectural history should be followed when you're doing these assessments.
All right.
Back to the dam.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Megan. So when you are surveying an individual building or other architectural resource, you'll want to use one of our historic site forms. These forms have text fields, text boxes, and drop downs where you enter architectural data, historic information, and current property details, along with uploading, or attaching photographs to the form. We have a standard form that you use when you do an in-depth documentation and research of a building, whether you're doing it for 106 mitigation or for a community-funded project, a school assignment, or if you're a building owner, for your own edification, whatever the reason, the form and the guidance instructions help you thoroughly document the building. And let me put the link to that in our chat here so you can see what that is like. Sorry, just one second. So anyway, with this standard form, we have both a Word version you can fill out, and our office has recently created a fillable PDF version you can use too. We also have another version of the site form, which was created for the purpose of providing information about properties within Section 106 submissions. It's the 106 Historic Site Short Form, and it's essentially a light version of our standard historic site form that I just referenced. I'll also send you a link to that here in a minute. This form does not require as much in-depth research. What it does provide me with, though, with the vast majority of compliance-related submissions, is enough information for me to be able to concur or not with your evaluation and determine as to whether the building is eligible for the National Register. So if you're an agency or CRM consultant, if you fill out this form and provide it to me for a federal or state compliance related review, I should have enough information for my review. And that was the sole purpose of the short form, was for the initial cut of eligibility calls for 106. SHPO didn't want agencies or consultants having to do a lot of extra in-depth research and documentation on individual buildings. 106 cases where that's not really necessary. If we end up doing mitigation on a project, or if a property needs to be further researched for another reason, then you can use the standard historic site form. I think the short form is pretty self-explanatory how to fill out, with some basic instructions on the form. But if you ever have questions about the form or how to fill it out, or questions about the building you're documenting, like you said, or which form you should be using, just let me know. I'm happy to help. Let's see. Yeah, next slide here. So we have the individual site form. We also have a survey process and forms for completing a survey of multiple buildings. So it's what's known as a reconnaissance level survey. RLSs, as we call them, are the most basic approach for systematically documenting and evaluating historic buildings in Utah. Like I said, it's designed for dealing with larger groups of buildings, generally more than 10, but you can do it for fewer as well if you'd like. The RLSs can include all or a large portion of the buildings in a community. We see these recon surveys a lot with big, Section 106 projects, such as with UDOT undertakings. And a lot of communities will pay to have RLSs done in their city to help them determine whether or not they might have enough historic buildings to comprise a historic district. The purpose is to provide a first cut of buildings in a given area that appear to be eligible for listing in the National Register. The Recon survey involves not only a visual evaluation of the properties, but it doesn't provide an assessment of the historical events or individuals. The focus with these is on age and integrity of the buildings, based on a quick visual assessment. If you discover buildings through your Recon survey that appear to be significant, then additional information can be attained through historical research conducted as part of an in-depth, intensive level survey. And so the photo you see on this slide is of Panguitch's downtown. And Corey and I actually did an RLS of Panguitch about 17 years ago when I first started in the office. And that RLS was the foundation to the city of Panguitch later, being listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a historic district. Panguitch is a certified local government, had that done. So, when you do one of these RLS surveys, the survey boundaries are defined by, a multitude of reasons, the purpose, budget, time, and location of known historic resources. And once that boundary is decided, it can be decided in conjunction and it should be in consultation with our office. The consultant doing the survey should talk to us and get a cut of the existing data that might already be within the boundary. If there is existing data, then that will be updated as part of the new RLS and provided to our office. And I will provide links to how to do an RLS as well and our information on those here in a minute. In general, these surveys are conducted along streets in a systematic, building by building fashion in a logical manner throughout the community. You'll photograph each building, record its address, evaluate whether or not each building is eligible. Like I said, mainly based on age and integrity, and provide architectural data such as style and type, data construction, materials, use, etc. And you'll need to contact our office to receive our data spreadsheet that you'll need to enter the data on as well. And we'll provide information on what we're looking for along with other information. So in the end, you'll provide us with data, a map, photographs, and a final report. And the report will include a statement of survey objectives, boundaries, a brief outline of the history of the community surveyed, or the area, bibliography, survey results, recommendations, fieldwork techniques, etc. Hopefully it provides a good overview of the area and ultimately information on whether or not it would be, ripe for a historic district. Or if there may be important individual buildings that were found as part of the survey that might be worth following up on. So, those are our two survey types, the intensive level surveys and the reconnaissance level surveys. Just an overview of our site forms and recordings. Like I said, at the beginning, we'd be happy to provide more in-depth trainings on these topics or, any other building related topics you would benefit from, just let us know. But, I think with that, I'll turn the time over to Corey and let him have the majority of the time. He has an exciting architectural history presentation planned. So I'll turn the time over to him unless you have further questions for me.
Yeah, as Chris noted, when we do surveys, we evaluate properties for their historic integrity, which most of you know about. Because I've condensed two presentations basically into one today for about 45 minutes, I'm not going to have a chance to discuss integrity a lot with these property types, but really quick before I start, probably the first thing you want to look at with integrity is what impacts been made to the building. Are they major? Were they done during whatever your period of significance is that you're looking at? Just because a building has an addition on it outside the period of significance doesn't make it an ineligible or not contributing building. It just depends. It's on its size, where it's visible from on the property. What we see mostly in the field is buildings that have been re-sided, new windows put on, small additions, and sometimes you get into gray areas whether or not it's contributing property or not. Then you have to take into account some other issues like the context in which it was altered. Typically, we'll say if a property receives new siding and new windows, so you can't actually touch the original building, that would make it a non-contributing or ineligible property. If windows have been cut larger, especially prominent windows, that will typically make a building not eligible as well. But there's a million scenarios, almost one for each different building that you can look at. So most of the properties I'm showing are all contributing properties because I'm using them as examples. But if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask, and I will also have a couple of poll questions as we go along. So let's see here. So when I'm talking about the Utah's architecture, we're talking about property types that were started here, of course, when the area was primarily settled by Anglo-Americans, the Mormon settlers that came in 1847. We talk about influences outside of Utah because the early settlers kind of came as one cohesive body and settled here, bringing patterns of architecture that they knew about from wherever they came from. Probably many of you have heard of the famous folklorist Henry Glassy, and he termed this kind of fusion of ideas called patterns of diffusion. And this map in one of his book, Patterns of Material and Folk Culture of the Eastern United States, shows where a lot of these primary nodes were. And you can see how ideas would intermingle as frontier settlement pushed west off the East Coast. These people would go from their various regions to new regions and intermingle with those from other regions. And therefore, their ideas intermingled as they built homes. And when we talk about this pattern of building, we're talking about what's called vernacular architecture. That term applies to basically what we call common or everyday architecture that you see, not high style architecture that is usually designed by architects, but that was influenced by builders. Also, we have a term called folk architecture, and I kind of refer that to buildings that happened prior to the railroad coming to Utah. So anything that was using indigenous materials, local building practices, that would be termed folk architecture, but vernacular architecture is kind of the common everyday architecture. So nowadays it might be like strip malls or manufactured homes, those that don't really require an architect to design. But this pattern of diffusion really influenced Utah architecture early on because most of the early immigrants came from Nauvoo, Illinois, but they in turn had come from various parts of the Northeast, the South, the Mid-Atlantic areas of the country. It wasn't until about a decade later that you started getting influence from Europe, as you had a lot of Danish immigrants coming into Utah, as well as Swiss and some other parts of Europe. And then later on, more towards the end of the 19th century, people from Eastern Europe and Italy as they came here for mining. And in turn, each of their backgrounds influenced Utah's architecture a little bit. But for the most part, the architecture here was pretty homogeneous in that it was influenced by what the main leaders of the LDS Church had experienced from their hometowns, and people wanted to fit in as they moved here. So that kind of directed the design of the architecture. Later on, whoops, I'm sorry, going backwards here. Later on, as the railroad came, that changed how architecture was designed in Utah. And you had these ideas coming from both the East and the West Coast to this fairly isolated region, large region. And so they started getting ideas from pattern books, primarily from the AJD guys, Andrew Jackson Davis and Alexander Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing, who published several pattern books for architecture. Most of this was high style, featuring Italianate and Gothic revival, which was really popular at the time in the mid 1800s. These pattern books made their way here to Utah and started to influence the basic austere classical vernacular forms that started out here and injected more of this more, I guess, Victorian types and these more organic forms into the architecture in Utah. Another influence on the architecture here was how the towns were developed, and these were all based on Joseph Smith's plat for the city of Zion, which he had come up with and planned for Jackson County, Missouri, and then in Nauvoo, Illinois, where they settled and started planning their towns. It was never fully realized here in Utah. The basic square blocks or rectangular blocks, wide streets, the gridded platting of the cities was the main influence here, but it never took on his full intent of having 3 center blocks that were all based on church government buildings. And as it started to develop, as towns were settled throughout the territory as it spread out in the 1850s, they based it on this grid pattern, but not the full plan. And so Salt Lake, you have various gridded parts outside of, was it 9th South when they had the big field, that slowly got developed over time. Brigham Young really fought to keep the larger lot sizes with a home, garden areas, and small agricultural buildings. But over time, the pressure to develop here from outside of the state really, influenced how the planning started taking a different turn, with plots being subdivided with narrow lots, and that really influenced later architecture, starting mostly like in the 1880s on. And so you get different house forms. When I'm discussing this today, we are talking about the architectural type. And so we classify buildings mostly by the type, or in the case of residential properties, the basic layout of the floor plan. We also talk about style, but that's more of a outside kind of influence, more on design characteristics rather than the plan. Today I'm going to be talking mostly about types, but you'll see various different styles, stylistic, architectural adornments on these properties. You could have the same floor plan of a house, but it could have, half a dozen different styles attributed to it. So it's really kind of hard to talk about style as a way to categorize architecture. Unfortunately, that's still how the National Register nomination forms are based, is on the style. That's the terms they use. But I know they are in the process, probably a 50-year process of trying to update their bulletin, which is typical for a Park Service. And I think they are moving towards more of a type classification in that. So before we get into real architecture, we're going to start with dugouts. Most of you are probably archaeologists, and I'm sure a good portion of you have seen dugouts, or what remains of dugouts. But this really was a form of housing, even though you might not call it architectural, where the house was dug into the ground about 6 feet down, typically about 12 to 16 feet square. And the walls were lined with either logs or brick or stone, depending on what the materials were available. But they're very rudimentary, very expedient. They would dig into a hillside if they could, so they could have a full front-facing wall, like these two examples, which were built on the same hill in Spring City. I'm not even sure if these are there anymore. But you can see they used local stone and also railroad ties to build the front wall and then dig it partially into the back of the hillside. The roofs were made depending on what was available, typically with a large pole, a center pole, which they'd lay smaller poles off to the side to create rafters, and then they would cover those with brush and mud. And as you can probably well picture, in a heavy rainstorm, these things leak pretty badly, and they'd have to be covered again. Later on, this is the roofs of the two, or at least one that I just showed there. They would cover them with dimension lumber as more protection. You can see a good how on this gabled form, how they had these ridge poles and purlins and rafters to support the roofs. The bottom photo shows a later repair where they used like galvanized sprinkler pipe to upgrade the roof on this one. Here's another great one. I think Chris Merritt got this photo of from a dugout in western Iron County near Cedar City, the Gold Springs mining district. And you can see they used corrugated tin to cover the roof of this to make it more usable. They just ran the gamut of designs. Here's a really nice one in Emery County on ranching property that they used semi-ashlar stone for the front wall and some pretty heavy duty pipe and logs to support the roof. And then finally, a pretty high style version. Probably a lot of you have seen this one, the road from Wellington out to 9 Mile Canyon. This house is almost right on the road. You can tell they put a lot of effort into this one with the poured concrete foundation and then upper bricked in gables and then very round poles for their purlins. This is let's see here. So you can see here the stove that they built, or the partial chimney they put on the nicely plastered wall. And they also had wallpaper on this at one point as well that came off. So the next step up, we move above ground with the most rudimentary above ground house form, the single cell house. This is based on an earlier British type of housing that was mostly in worker areas of blue collar towns or settlements in England. The single cell, or also called the single pen house, is what the name implies. It's got a single room, usually at least one or two windows in it. And this is typically what we think of as the log cabins. There's the myth of the log cabin that every state that was settled had early log cabins as their homes. That's not always the case, but in Utah, a lot of the earlier homes were of logs. And they were influenced by either Scandinavian or Eastern European immigrants who had moved here, and their log and notching styles can be seen in the influence on these properties. This shows a few examples of the early log single cells. The top one is the William Hawk cabin, probably one of the earliest homes still surviving in Salt Lake County. This was in the Pioneer Park at one time when it was a fort, and then they moved it a few blocks north of there on 300 West. And it had nicely shaped adze logs, so they're hewn logs that are flat. Most of the more expedient ones were just the round logs that they removed the bark from in these lower two examples. The William Hawk cabin, even though it's wider, was still only a single room, so it's we call it a single cell cabin. This is not how cabins were made, but I thought this is interesting. I wonder if anybody's ever tried this before. So we move from log cabins to single cell, more refined homes. These run the age. So like this lower stone one was down in Gunnison. It was probably an earlier form. It's in random ashlar stone. This was restored back about 20 years ago. You can see it was nicely restored. All of these examples are actually in Sanpete County. This one I know is gone now, but it had very nice Victorian detailing on it. An addition in the back that probably had a stairway that accessed the upper story. But because of the size of these, they had to be, I guess, creative in finding ways to use that upper attic story. And so this home here is in Spring City. This is a later one built in about 1906, actually. And they had to build an exterior staircase so they could have a room upstairs, probably where the kids all slept. But they could also build on lean-tos on the back. This one has a lean-to to provide more space. They could have an interior stairwell. But they were a very common house type that were later expanded with crosswings. We'll get into that in a little bit here. Here's one that's typically known as a stack house on the eastern United States, where it's a single cell with a story above and also a nice addition on the back. This one is actually still standing. I found this image of it on Google Earth that was taken in, I think, 2015. And you can see they plastered it. And I'm not sure what it looks like now, but they're building a pretty substantial addition. So I'm sure this one's probably not a contributing property anymore because of that large addition that takes up the view from the street. So the next logical extension of a single cell would be a double cell. And this, as the name implies, is a two-room house with two equally sized rooms on it. I just want to talk really quick here about the symmetry involved in early architecture in Utah. Because of the classical influence that started after the Revolutionary War in the Northeast especially, but across the Eastern Seaboard, when the new republic was established, they looked at earlier democracies to base everything on, whether that was design, art, and so forth. And so this really, the Greek and Roman settlements or cultures really influenced architecture in the Eastern United States. And this was shown in the symmetry of buildings, where you had very flat walls, very little architectural decoration, mostly just in the door surrounds, window surrounds, and maybe the cornice returns on the properties. This was brought here and it was kind of adopted as what a lot of early researchers of historic Utah architecture called the Mormon style. It's not really a Mormon style, it's more just of the classical style. Part of that also was the setup, the appearance of the doors and the windows on the front that were symmetrically placed, mostly based on bilateral symmetry, where if you cut the building in half lengthwise, it would mirror the other half of it. So the double cell was kind of a problem with that. If you look at this diagram, you can't have a single door in the middle, otherwise it opens into a wall right here. And so to allay that problem, they would build two doors. And then sometimes you would have either a single window or a door in the middle and a window on each side. A lot of people attribute this to the polygamy influence on architecture. A lot of people think that this was a polygamous design process in Utah, where it really wasn't. I've been all over the Eastern United States. I've seen this anywhere from New England to Pennsylvania down to Louisiana. You see houses with two doors. And I think for the most part, it was just for ease of access into the rooms, or in the case of down in New Orleans or Louisiana, a climate control issue where you could only open two doors and allow the flow of air through there. But it really was a symmetry issue. So you could have an even number of equally placed openings on the front of the property to meet that Republican, that Democratic ideal of symmetry. So here's a few examples. The top one is down in Santa Clara, and it was actually moved from the Silver Reef mining area down there, built in probably the 1850s, moved down, and then kind of some newer design elements added to it. The bottom one is up in Cache County. I think it's in Mendon, the George Washington Baker House. You can see this is an example where you have a central door with two windows flanking the door. Some other examples, I always throw this one in because these were my, well, the bottom one is my great-grandmother's house. The top one was her sister wife's house. Both of these were built in Pine Valley in the 1850s. My great-great-grandfather, Robert Gardner, had 4 wives. 3 of them moved up to Pine Valley when he moved up there to run a sawmill in the 1860s. And he built these 2 homes for them. Interestingly, these are double cell homes, which people attribute to polygamy. These were 2 polygamous wives. However, they did not share a home. It was a single family living in each home. So you can see there that it was mostly a design choice to use these double cell homes. Unfortunately, the top one was demolished a few years ago. And then a couple of larger examples down in Manti. The lower one is the Cox Shoemaker Perry house, which changed hands several times early on. It was built in 1858 as a double cell. It was sold to Orville Sutherland Cox, or no, he was the original owner, and then it was sold to Jezreel Shoemaker later on. The style was more of a central passage at that time, so he took away the one door, put a window there, and just had the single opening on it. So these properties changed hands over times and changed styles over times. Here's another example. This one is in Orem, the Skinner house that was built in the early 1900s as a single cell. And then they added a mirror image on the other side a few years later in about 1908 to expand the size. So the next house is probably the most popular one of the 1800s in Utah. This dominated the housing in Utah. Hall Parlor House. It gets its name, it's actually an ancient term from England. And it's almost like a double cell, but the second room added is not quite as big. And this makes for the possibility of making the front symmetrical with an odd number of openings. So instead of two doors, you have a single door flanked by either one window or two windows. But you can see the hall is the larger room here. It's based on the ancient term hall, where most of the activities took place, whether that's cooking, sleeping, doing the daily chores, whatever. And then the smaller room is the parlor. And this was usually used as a bedroom as well, but it's where the fancy furniture was kept and the parents usually slept. The diagram here showing what an ancient from the 13th century in England hall parlor looked like. So this would be the hall part where the fire and the fireplace was kept, and then here where the sleeping was done, and then a central kind of runway going through the house. As time went on, it got a little more developed and refined, where the whole thing was enclosed rather than just an open outside passage running through it. It was a doorway that opened up and two rooms were separated. As you get to the United States, this gets even more refined. And then in Utah, you get the smaller versions, mostly because of the lack of money, lack of time to build larger homes early on. But it was a very popular type. Have a couple of examples here. The top one is in Mount Pleasant. It was built in the late 1860s, very nice brickwork, and some Greek revival detailing on it in these window hood moldings. The bottom one is more of a Victorian example, probably from around 1900 to 1905, where it has these semi-elliptical arches from the Victorian era, and then a bungalow style front porch. That porch was built in the period of significance era early on in the early 20th century, so it's still considered a contributing part of the house. Here's some more examples. These are a couple of two-story examples. When we talk about the type, we are only looking at the main floor. We don't look at the top floor. Top floors in these hall parlor homes varied. Either like you might have a hall parlor plan on top with a small room and a large room, or just open all the way across. Or you might have a central passage room, which we'll talk about here in a second. So we're only classifying these by the main floor plan. This version here looks like it was one that started out as a single cell and then added on. Even though it's a hall parlor plan, you can tell by this offset chimney, because the chimney has to rest on a wall, and you can see that wall is not centered. So you know that this room here is smaller than this room, but the walls are not, or the openings are not symmetrical across the front. So this one kind of expanded over time, and then also received this later addition. So I wanted to show you kind of the gamut of things you can run across when looking at these properties. Central passage is the next expansion, and this was not quite as common in Utah because of its size. It was a lot larger, more difficult to build because you have a central hallway, which the term comes from. Central passage or central hall is a term used on the East Coast, United States. From the outside, sometimes these are difficult to distinguish between these and a larger hall parlor because they have an odd number of symmetrical openings. And sometimes you get 5 openings on a hall parlor that's a little bit wider. So without going inside, it's hard to tell unless they have chimneys placed over the walls here, where you can see that these are resting on the walls inside. And so you know that this has a central hallway. It's usually the wealthier people that built these because they created a public space inside the house where you could bring in visitors, but they didn't have access unless provided that to the 2 side rooms, which were usually closed off by doorways. So it was more of a public-private house rather than just mostly public, where the entry into a single, double, or hall parlor went right into the living area. Some more examples of 2-story versions with the end chimneys where you can't really tell from the outside if it's a central passage or not. Probably the most common type of central passage house in the country was what was termed the I house. There's only a few full-blown examples of these in Utah. This one's in Salt Lake. And the reason it got the name I house, it's distinguished by 5 openings across, a central doorway, chimneys on the ends, and typically only run 1 room deep rather than 2 rooms deep on the side. And a lot of times it would have these cornice brackets on it that are from the Italian 8 style. They were very common in Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, the I states, which is kind of where this informal term I house came from. So this is one of the only a handful in Utah.
Corey, let me know
Now
when
we
you
move
want me
to
to deploy the poll.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead and do that. Do I need to stop my presentation while you do that?
No. So do you want me to do the hall and parlor one?
Yeah, go ahead with the first one. And one thing I want to talk about also, I forgot to about symmetry, as you answer these questions, is it was based, or the very classical appearance, austere appearance of these earlier homes was based on a very planar, flat type of facade. And this was typically done through stuccoing. The earliest homes in Utah, some were built from wood, but because of lack of wood and need for wood for other things like fire, it was discouraged of building homes from wood. And so the next easiest material they could build from was adobe, which there was a lot of clay available, and people could typically create a clay pit on the property of their home and make the bricks by hand there, just using mud and straw. And the biggest part was turning that up using either a mule or donkey or so forth, or just by hand, and then placing in these wood molds to create these bricks, which they would then sit out on the ground and dry after probably a week or so. You get the whole family involved, you could build a house pretty quickly that way, but that created a very flat surface. The next most popular building material would be stone because there was a lot of that available. And by looking at photos of houses, you can tell almost regionally where a particular house is without actually knowing, being told where that was built. So a lot of sandstone in the south half of the state, a lot of metamorphic or igneous stone in the central and northern parts of the states. But even in looking at the clay in the adobe bricks, you can tell. Salt Lake, a lot of the adobe is gray, whereas the further south you head, it's more orange or tan. And then if they had the money, over time, they would plaster over that adobe to protect it, keep it from turning to mud in heavy rainstorms. So there's still a few, a good handful of homes that were never stuccoed, adobe homes still standing in the state. But most of those were stuccoed over time. And then, of course, by the 1860s, where brick yards were starting to be made, and they could ship in wood and had more wood available to fire brick kilns, brick became the most common building material after that, well into the 20th century. So now we have the pair house.
Wait, Corey. So we're gonna end the poll and see the results. So that was just for the hall and parlor
The first-
house. So can you see
Okay.
that one?
Yes. So the hall parlor, most of you were listening, came from England. Those photos of ancient homes. And you could be right on New England and mid-Atlantic region. As the original version started in England and spread out to Northern Europe, and then of course over to the early settlement areas in the United States. So I'll give most of you a pass. It was not influenced from Scandinavia.
Okay, and then let's do just the other one since you just talked about it. The building type. And then you can go back into your presentation. So I just launched another poll for you guys. What is the most common building material in 19th century? Corey just talked about that. So.
Yeah. So adobe brick is the most common type by far. And then later on, I mean, brick, as I said, was limited. They saved out for industrial and for basic utilitarian needs rather than siding. There are a few older wood-sided homes, but it didn't become more common until around the turn of the 20th century as a material, and mostly like in Northeast Utah, where they had access to more wood up in the Uintas. Okay, and then what was the other one?
Well, let me deploy it. I'm not sure if you've covered it yet. It's the most common 19th century house type.
Yeah,
so if you
that
covered
was
it, I'll
the-
deploy it, but don't say the answer because we want them to.
Okay.
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 I'll launch it and then we'll see if people get it right.
Okay. So looks like a pretty close toss up. Most of you didn't get this right. Single cell was pretty common. That was probably the earliest housing and the most simple, but the hall parlor was by far the most common building type in Utah, sorry, not the United States, in Utah, up to about 1890s. It is possible that a lot of those could have started out as single cells and were added to. So we'll give you a pass on that one, those who chose single cell as well.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I'm way behind here, so I'm going to skip through these really fast. We still have a whole century to cover here. So the pair house is a Swedish form that began in the 16th century and spread to Norway and then later to Denmark. But it's another type that came here when the Scandinavian immigrants came in the 1850s. And you can see here that it's almost like a central passage, although instead of a hallway in the middle, it's a main room with a pair of rooms off each side, hence the term pair house. There's okay, so just here's some examples. Most of these, it was mostly common in Sanpete County with a few up in northern Utah as well, but primarily Sanpete County. You can see by the placement of the chimneys on these where the room walls are. And they varied in size from a very tiny room in the middle to a wider room. When I talked about early settlement architecture and the influence of democracy, the newly democratic republic, the Greek revival became very common in the United States in the early 19th century and around the turn of 18th and 19th centuries. It made its way across the eastern seaboard in various forms, but in the South, it was very popular in plantation homes where you even had some full-blown examples that mimicked Greek temples. But it's based on the three Greek orders of architecture, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. In Utah, it was very simple. It's in temple form in Utah, the entrance is on the gable end of the property. It usually has a Greek entablature on it with a full cornice and cornice returns mimicking a Greek temple. This is in Sanpete County. This is down in Mount Pleasant. Sometimes it was just on the side of a house, even though the entry wasn't here. But you could see that Greek temple form here. And then most of the time in Utah, it came with flanking wings on each side, as you can see on these examples. Probably the best example of a Greek or the temple form is the Ephraim Co-op mercantile building in Ephraim, which is a very fancy ornate building with this temple form end on it. We move into the side passage. Now we're getting into the more organic forms of architecture where everything is an austere square, no decoration on it. Now we're getting into the Victorian and picturesque styles in Utah. The side passage is kind of an ambiguous term as it applies to several different Victorian forms, but it refers to the entry here is kind of on the side, but it enters into a side little passageway, a kind of a public space that would then go into these more private areas. But you can see in several different styles, like the central block building, this Italianate style building, this very plain, ornate, not ornate, kind of stack house type building, where the entrance is on the side here. And without going inside, you would not know that these were side passage homes. One other example is this is one down in Pink, which is called a 2/3 Georgian, where you take, it's kind of like they started building this kind of more classical style home, but they never finished it. So it does have a side passage here that enters the home. And then the most common type of Victorian form in Utah that took over from the hall parlor starting around the 1880s or 1890s is the crosswing. This shows a good example of the various types of crosswings you have. A lot of the crosswings were developed from earlier standing architecture, like you may have a central cell home, or sorry, a single cell home where they added on a crosswing, or perhaps a hall parlor home where they added on 2 crosswings. So we have a typical T crosswing, an L crosswing are the 2 most common types. We also have the cruciform or central crosswing and the H plan or double crosswing. And just show you a couple of examples here. These are all L plans, like I said, which was the most common type of crosswing form in the state. And these went well into the 20th century. They're building crosswings up into the 19 teens. And then these are some interesting, this is a T wing with the T extension off the back. If you were just looking at the front, you would think it was either a hall parlor or a central passage type house, which this front part probably was. This is a pretty famous house in Midway, and this is a central crosswing. There aren't many of these. There are a few more of these double crosswings. This is an American fork. And then what we call a half crosswing, where this is almost like a temple form house where the intent was at some point to build a crosswing off the side and provide access to another wing. This one never happened. I think this house actually got enveloped into a McMansion, unfortunately. And then the central block with projecting bay was the other common Victorian form in Utah. Sometimes it takes on a crosswing plan, but it has, as the name implies, more of a central core unit like this. Usually it's pyramidal, and then you have bays, whether it's one or multiple ones coming off the side. These are a couple of very, very simple, humble kind of more Victorian cottages in the central block projecting bay type. And then some very ornate ones found throughout the state. This one's in Sanpete County, Utah County, and this one's up in the Avenues. But you can see that Victorian kind of organic architecture where you have things, different types of gable ends or turrets added to it, porches added, as architecture gets way more complex towards the end of the 20th or the 19th century. Okay, that is the 19th century architecture. Now we're going to move into the 20th century really quick, and I will run through these as fast as I can so you guys can get lunch. So we start out, shotgun is kind of transitional from the 8th or 19th century into the 20th century, and it's not very common in Utah, but there were enough built, especially in the mining towns, that it was common at one time. There's very few remaining still. But a shotgun home is basically this floor plan with the front door enters into a room, which provides access to a back room. And the term shotgun, nobody knows really where it came from, but the implied terminology is you could fire a shotgun through the middle of the house and it would go clear out the back. In remembrance of our friends in Louisiana, New Orleans area getting hit by the hurricane today, this is a photo of one I took in New Orleans several years ago of how refined the shotgun house was. And really, when you talk about New Orleans, shotgun homes were the primary house type there. There were just thousands of them all over the place. They were budget housing, low income housing, and they're built on these very narrow lots. So that's kind of an elaborate Victorian style one. Here's the examples we have in Utah, the ones I could find anyway. This bottom one was probably more typical of shotguns in Utah. I think this is up in Park City, but you can see how simple it was, just kind of a frame with siding thrown on it. This one's in Salt Lake. It's got some tar paper fake brick on it. These were down in Helper, I think. And I found these interesting because these look like they were built probably in the 1940s. So that shotgun form is still carrying on up into the mid 20th century. Another type that we don't see that commonly now, but were part of the early 19th or 20th century landscape of Utah is the Homestead Temple House. And these could be mistaken for bungalows, although they're usually typically taller than a bungalow. And interestingly, all of these examples are down in Green River, which was settled a little bit later. And so this house form was common in the late 19th century throughout the country, especially in the Midwest, but it's a taller form. And like a later version of the Temple House, the entrance is on the end, but it's not as classical looking. It's more quickly built, typically of wood, not as substantial. And then a lot of times there would be a porch that was enclosed on these. Foursquare is more common in urban areas in Utah. And a lot of people mistake these for bungalows, but the Foursquare is usually a two-story type of house. And it's, as the name implies, the plan is based on 4 square rooms, or not quite square rooms. And it's either in a single story or a multiple story house. You'll typically see it in Utah with a central gable, a hipped roof with a central dormer on the top. And is usually neoclassical with a porch with classical columns on it, with different types of brick embellishment or stucco in prairie style form. So these are the more elaborate examples that you'll find in Salt Lake, Provo, Ogden, those areas. And these are the more humble forms, which you may find like this one in a mining town, a single story Foursquare. You can see that the pyramidal roof meets at a point on these. Hence, it gives the, you can tell that it's a square plan. So these are also in urban and in mining areas, especially like that top version. Along with the Foursquare, we have the bungalow, which was the most common type of housing in Utah, probably up until from 1900 to about 1920. Everybody knows a bungalow. The name, the provenance in these is that it was probably started in India. And bungalow basically was a house with a porch on it, and especially in tropical climates where the porch would surround the house, providing outside living areas. It really took off in the early 1900s in the United States with Frank Lloyd Wright and his prairie school style, which influenced which was based on bungalow style, but it had his stamp on it with very low ground hugging look, with a low hipped roof on it and a large porch, large columns, a lot of brick and stucco. The other influence was the arts and crafts movement. And you don't see many of these in Utah, but they would usually have a gable end with a broad side facing the street and a large front porch, which was engaged as part of the roof. And these typically had either stone or brick or shingle siding on them, and mostly common in the East Bench and the Avenues areas of Salt Lake. But you can find them in other urban areas in the state. Bungalow typically entered into one large room, and then the kitchen was found behind that, and 1 or 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It was kind of the first technical home where the bathroom was actually incorporated into the interior rather than added on as a later addition. It was a time of technical and architectural development in the United States. So these were really fully amended homes. So this bottom one would be an arts and crafts with kind of a colonial or a Dutch colonial influence. This one is another arts and crafts with a arts and crafts influence with the stone battered columns on it. And then this kind of a plain one, looks like the porch columns have been replaced in the 1950s. Here's some more common examples of brick that you'll find all over Salt Lake City, Provo, and Ogden. More of a, with the hipped roof, more of a prairie style influence. But you also see a lot of these broad porches with a gable end and a gable end window as well. Box bungalow is another form. It's a more simple form. A lot of times there won't even be a porch on it, but it's basically a square box, 1 story, or 1.5 in this case, with perhaps a porch thrown on later, but they're typically more expediently built with wood siding and not much thought put into any architecture detail on them. And these are mostly found in more rural areas. Period cottage, by the 1920s, the period cottage took over as the most common house type in Utah, found both in urban and rural settings. These implemented what we call the period revival styles, those based on previous, whether it's Northern European or British styles, or even exotic styles like Egyptian or Spanish or Pueblo styles. But the basic house form we call period cottages, because they were typically small. As in this case, it looks like it probably has a basic bungalow plan, but it's got this taller front portion where there might be an attic or another room up there. Examples you see, we call this, with its all brick, this very steeply pitched roof with a very prominent kind of a battered chimney on it and some ornamental brickwork. In Utah, we call these the English cottage styles because they have an English form. If it has any type of false half timbering, like with stucco and this half timbering, we would call it a Tudor style. Or if it's all stucco, then that would be a Tudor style. That's kind of more of a distinguishing characteristic we have here in Utah. A lot of places would just call these Tudor style as well because they have the very steeply pitched roof. This example here is one that was originally a crosswing house, Victorian, that they added Tudor style example or styling on it. So here we have a French Norman style with that little turret on it, a Dutch colonial style with the gambrel roof. This is more just kind of a eclectic kind of a colonial revival with these round arched windows. Same with this one here. These would almost be considered bungalows, but this one has kind of that battered chimney with the fancy stonework in it that you see a lot of times in rural areas. Some other examples, mission style, Spanish colonial, Pueblo. Really, this should have stucco on it to be a true Pueblo style, and this one's got Pueblo influence on it. So you run into these all over the place in Utah, the period cottages. Another version of these is the clipped gable cottage. And these are distinguished by, they're fairly plain on the outside, but they have this jerkin head or clipped gable roof on it that runs usually parallel to the street. It can be fancy. It can have like a classical style porch on the front or no porch at all in these examples, but it is a rectangular form with clipped off gables. So that's the clipped gable cottage.
Hey, Corey, we've got a
Yes.
question in the chat. So David Dick from Zion National Park asks, what do you call the feature where one side of the roof extends to the ground?
That would probably be either a Tudor or English cottage style. That happened, that very steeply pitched gable is part of the Tudor movement. It's based on that ancient Tudor form. They had really steep pitch, but it was, in the 20s and 30s, it was stylized. You might see it swoop out as well. It wouldn't be a straight line, but rather kind of a curved form that would extend clear to the ground as well. Cape Cod is kind of a period cottage as well, but it's its own unique form. It's kind of carried on from the 1600s in the United States. It's a boxy form with a kind of a steeply pitched gabled roof that's parallel to the street. But the main distinguishing characteristic on this is it will have dormers on the front part, pretty prominent dormers, either 2 or 3 or 4 sometimes, or in this lower right case, a single dormer on a narrow form with a garage attached. This kind of it's own form, but it has that basic period cottage, or the cottage Cape Cod form here on the main house part. These aren't as common, and they're mostly found in the Salt Lake City East Bench neighborhoods. I think this one's down in Liberty Wells neighborhood. Basement house is kind of a unique form. It's like a 20th century dugout. These were found they're called hope houses sometimes, but they were built for expediency and lack of money, especially during the Great Depression and World War II, as late as that. But they would build this below ground thing and just put a roof over it, with the intent later as adding another story, an above ground story. And I think we know of a couple of these where it happened, but a lot of times you wouldn't know because it's just, now it looked like a regular house if that top story was added. This is one in Orem that was being demolished. I took this photo about 15, 20 years ago, and they pulled the roof off and you could really see the rooms in here. And I couldn't get up any higher to get a better view of this. Most of the time they had some kind of a small gabled roof, but a lot of times they just have a flat roof, especially if they planned on using that flat roof as the floor for a above ground dwelling. And they have these kind of periscope entrances to get down there. So now we're in the post-war types. World War II era cottage. These started in the early 40s, about the time World War II started. Mostly because of lack of building materials and lack of money. The federal government started these small house plans that were available for people to use to build their homes. These are very common throughout the state in rural and urban areas. And they're just very small, usually 2 bedrooms, a small living room that went into a kitchen. If there was, a lot of times there's basement, but because of lack of room on the inside, the basement would be accessed by an exterior stairway that went down. But we call the style of this minimal traditional style because they kind of have a traditional form, but there's no real architecture to speak of on these. No, most of the time they just had these gables, or the cornice would be flush with the roof end, so there was no eaves like on this house. That's kind of uncommon for the era. Some larger forms, this is when you start getting attached garages to buildings. So the automobiles started becoming more accessible, available to people at this time. So they would build on the garage to these World War II cottages. And a lot of times when you encounter these now, these rooms may be filled in and turned into like a rec room or something like that, and a doorway put in here in place of the garage door. These transitioned in by the late 40s, early 50s into what we call the early ranch style. And all it is the property is expanding, the buildings are expanding on the property to cover more space as lots got bigger. And after the war, a lot of people got married, started having families right away, and they needed more room than what the World War II cottage could accommodate. And so they started expanding these. They still don't quite have a ranch look to them. These are some various examples. I love this one. The size of this chimney is just, if there was an earthquake, this chimney would crush that house. But that's a common architectural element of the late 50s, early 60s, is these huge chimneys, which were part of the more common ranch style homes. So here's a few more examples you could encounter. lots of gables on these. Sometimes it was more of a boxy form. And then here's some with garage additions on these as well. And then we transition to the ranch, which is just a more expanded version and a more simplified version of the early ranch. You got rid of all those gables as it became more of a, or less of a traditional form and more of its own form. The ranch house was actually developed in the 1930s. Cliff May was an early designer of these. And they were either these long forms or they were based on Spanish ranch homes, more of a U form with a court. But they took off across the United States in various contexts. Most one in Utah are these very vernacular forms with little architecture detailing on them. Very, very plain in most cases. Here's one we would call a raised ranch, where it's built on a raised foundation. And it kind of looks like a split level, but it's not, because the door enters on the main floor. Here's one we'd call a perpendicular ranch, where the house is actually perpendicular to the street and runs deep into the property. This one has an attached carport on it. And then ranches with garages built onto them. Another perpendicular one, and all you can see is the garage. Okay, I'm almost done here, so hold on for 5 more minutes. And then we have what we call the box ranch. These are more commonly found in rural areas. Again, like box bungalows, they're quickly built, usually of wood or vinyl or aluminum siding, but they're a very short version of a ranch. They were built later than the early ranches, more during the regular full-size ranch era. But they're very simple, not much architecture to them at all. And now we get to split levels in Utah. And most of you know the split level. The door enters on one floor, and then there's a stairway running down to a basement level or up to an upper level, going off that main level floor. Sometimes these were built in 4 levels. The house my dad built that I grew up in had actually 4 levels. And he intended the basement level to actually be an apartment, which it never was. But and sometimes these start out as a ranch like this one, and a split level is added to it. But how you can tell the split level is that it's like a half story above and a half story below the main entrance level here. So here you see different examples of it. A couple more common ones. This type here is probably the most common architectural styling you see in Utah, where it has this jutted out top story to create more room for the bedrooms upstairs. And I just threw this one in as a trick. This one looks like a split level, but it's really not, because you don't see a sub level down here. This is all one story here. So this is just an addition that was added, and they probably have a stairway in the back that accesses this top story. And finally, the cousin of the split level, which most people don't distinguish, but we do here because they are really different on the inside. That's the split entry house. And what distinguishes this from the split level is that the split entry, you enter the house on a platform. There's just a little entry vestibule, and this either goes up to the upper floor or the lower floor. And there's a full floor across both the upper story and the lower story. So you don't just have a single level that accesses these, but it's one full level up, one full level down that's accessed from an entry vestibule. And these are just a few examples here. Here's one that they've added another level up with this garage addition. So, and that is 20th century architecture in Utah. And that is the end of my program. So I hope you all enjoyed that, or got something out of it anyway.
Thank you, Corey, for doing that. Appreciate that.
Yeah, sorry to take so long. It's tough to put 150 years of architecture into 45 minutes or so.
No, that's great. And, I live in a split entry home, so I know that very well. So thank you for including the post-World War II stuff into this, because we're getting into that post war period where a lot of things are becoming historic right now. So my own mortality is coming into focus. Well, Savannah, I'll look at you. You were the MC for this event. Oh, Priscilla Burton asks, is there an outline of the house type somewhere that we can access?
Yes, there is. If you go to, well, I'll throw the link in here. But if you go to history.utah.gov, there on the website, I'm going to have to find the actual page it's on. If you go to the building resources link, at the bottom of that page, there's Utah's Historic Architecture Guide. And most of these slides and information was pulled from that. And I'm bringing up that link so I can throw it in the chat here.
Okay, thank you,
Thanks,
Corey. Were there any last questions? I know we went over time, but we're loving that there's 60 people still on here. Were there any other questions for Corey?
I thought there'd be 6 left after that.
Okay, see no more questions. Back to you, Sue.
So I put everybody's email in the chat from SHPO here today. Of course, we're going to share the presentation from Corey and myself, which includes Chris Hansen's presentation as well. So you guys should have access to all those resources, the links in that, and then our email addresses, which are also found on our website. I would say right now, since we're all working from home and moving offices and stuff, our phone numbers aren't like working a lot. Like some people are answering their phones, some people aren't. So email is the best way to contact us if you would like to. Other than that, we don't have anything else for you today. Thank you so much for attending. I think we are going to hopefully do another one of these in person in the not too near or the not too distant future, right? I think there's a need for this. People want to learn more about Section 106 and buildings, and like Merritt said, we can do more specific topics in the future as well. So without further ado, I think we can release you all. Thank you so much again, and I hope everybody has a great week.